again for coming. And Richard, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Ong, for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Ambassador Ong and through him Dean Joseph Liao for RSIS's hospitality to me and my wife. It's a great opportunity for us to be here for an extended time. I first came to Singapore in 1983, I think, and I've been here a number of times since, but it's always for a couple of days. It's always meeting rooms and hotel rooms and restaurant dining rooms, and so the chance to get out and see the society and see all that Singapore has to offer is a great thing. And this really is a very civilized place. And the chance to do this is a precious gift, and we're very grateful for it. I also am welcoming the chance to see a lot of old friends, and I do have a lot of good Singapore friends. James Tang is right there in the front row. Knowing people from Singapore has been one of the great benefits of the jobs that I've had working in the U.S. government. And I can tell you that Singapore's officials rate very highly in Washington, D.C. You can always depend on them to give you an objective, not self-serving definition of the situation concerning the situation in the region here, concerning Singapore's national interests, and also to tell United States officials very frankly when we are making mistakes. And that's very useful. That's very important. Ambassador Ong talked about sleepless nights, and I've had sleepless nights since Donald Trump was elected. I think that part of it is that, you know, in a tiny, tiny way, I made a tiny, tiny contribution to the East Asian order that the United States and our friends in the region helped to create. I had this feeling once President Trump was elected that the things that I had done over 30, 40 years were being wiped out in a stroke. I took it a little too personally, I think. I have a lot of admiration for the people who are in the U.S. government working day in and day out to keep our policy on a steady course. I happened to see one of those officials not too long ago, and I said to this person, you know, I'm really grateful that every morning you get up and go to work, that you continue to do your job in a new set of circumstances. Thank you very much for coming to listen to what I have to say. I look forward to our discussion afterwards. As Ambassador Ong said, the title of my talk is Leader No Longer, the United States in the 20th Century. It's important to know that at the end of Leader No Longer, there's a question mark. It's not period or full stop, it's a question mark. So I think it's up in the air, but I think it's very important that we understand what the issues are. Let me start by telling you about a book that my Brookings colleague Bruce Jones, he's also my boss, published in 2014. The book is called Still Ours to Lead, Still America's to Lead. And Bruce made a strong case in this book that America would and could continue to lead. He understood that other powers were becoming more important, more influential, but that the U.S. had enduring power, and with the help of allies, we could continue to be the most influential actor in the world. He thought that it was not in the interest of rising powers like China to break the existing order. And third, he said that the United States had ample ability and opportunity to lead in the future. Of course, this is not out of the mainstream of American thinking on its external policy. And at the time, it seemed to make perfect sense. At that time, Donald Trump's main claim to fame was that he had been the star of a TV reality show. Today, Donald Trump is President of the United States, and the ideas that Bruce put forward seem a little passé, a little quaint. We're in a new world. So my question today is whether the international community can count on the United States to play the activist role that we have played for most of the post-war period, when we provided security and economic public goods and set an example for others to follow. We were not a perfect example, to be sure, but we were an example all the same. I'm going to speak today in a rather speculative and personal way to answer my own question. Many factors are involved, and I understand some of these better than others. And I want to address three related parts of this issue. The first is President Trump, who, for some people, looms like a dark cloud over any current discussion of these issues. In fact, the fact that Donald Trump is in the East Asian region right now, going from Japan to Korea and China and Vietnam, looms like a dark cloud over my talk, because I don't know what he's going to do next. Second, I want to address a deeper set of problems in the United States, and Donald Trump is really just a symptom of these problems. He is not the cause. Finally, I want to discuss future role for the United States in East Asia. So, to start with the Trump factor. I said that Donald Trump is just a symptom of a much larger problem, but I don't mean to suggest that our president is inconsequential in his impact. Far from it. During the 2016 presidential campaign, Mr. Trump's statements regarding his foreign policy ideas conveyed that he was against multilateral trade agreements. He thought that others were using free trade to disadvantage the United States economically. He thought allies were free riding. These were not new ideas in American foreign policy thinking. I heard some of the same arguments working in the Congress in the 1980s. I think that's when Donald Trump got these ideas. He never changed those ideas, even though the world changed. And we can see evidence of this even in his summit. Mr. Trump's campaign rhetoric was decidedly outside the mainstream. His policy impulses and pugnacious style did tap into angry sentiment about the U.S. role in the world that surprised the political and economic policy elites. After the election, not all of Mr. Trump's words and deeds have been outside the mainstream, but that is where a lot of them are. He called into question the United States' one China policy before backing down. He withdrew the United States from TPP right after he was inaugurated. He has threatened to withdraw from NAFTA and the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, if only to force renegotiations on the terms of those two agreements. He announced the intention to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. He states his desire to end the U.S. commitments to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the Iran nuclear program. He's been quiet in the face of credible evidence that Russia interfered badly in our last presidential election. And he's complained that members of NATO are not paying their fair share. Donald Trump's not a total isolationist. He says he only wishes to balance the benefits of trade agreements, even as he risks destroying them. He is determined to defeat ISIS militarily, as if that would bring permanent peace to the Middle East. He's engaged in reckless brinksmanship regarding North Korea and its nuclear program without much regard to the dangers of a Second World War. But Trump's underlying approach is radically different from American security strategy after World War II. That is, an active role in world affairs. That strategy combined forward deployment of our military power onto the Eurasian landmass, maintaining alliances, shaping the architecture of global and trans-Pacific economic relations, and encouraging good governance. Forward deployment would shape the risk calculus of friends and adversaries alike, but also preposition the capabilities that the United States might need for warfighting if deterrence failed. Encouraging free trade would foster global growth and stimulate American economic competitiveness. America's Cold War and post-Cold War strategy was not always successful, far from it. Most of the U.S. administrations from Truman on were infected with some level of hubris. Each made mistakes, some of them quite damaging to U.S. interests. Each had to learn the stubborn realities of the world that they were trying to change. But at least over time, on balance, and in some regions, our strategy and policies fostered peace, development, prosperity, and stability. East Asia has been the most obvious success story, not just because of U.S. policy, but also because the region has been blessed with some outstanding leaders and hardworking people. President Trump, however, has initiated a new round in a long-standing debate going back over a century over the wisdom of an activist and internationalist role in world affairs. I fear that under the brand of America First, he will by accident or design much of past strategy and policy. I would just note that previous presidents would take exception to the suggestion that they did not put America first. There's another problem concerning the Trump administration. Aggravating the non-mainstream approach to the content of policy is the unorthodox process by which policy is formulated and implemented. The problem, as I see it, is that the institutionalized process that was created within the U.S. government after World War II to make decisions is in disarray. That process, you probably know, gave relevant agencies, whether the State Department, Defense Department, Commerce Department, and so on, each had a say in the formulation and implementation of policy. That process didn't always work, but my understanding is it is not being used now on all major decisions as it was in the past. And it's impossible to know from the outside whether U.S. policy actions are the result of this process or not. I would bet that in most cases the process hasn't been employed. Compounding this significant change are other problems. Senior policy positions at upper and middle levels of the bureaucracy remain unfulfilled. On some issues, at least, back channels have been the way the White House conducts diplomacy. Third, there is the dominating presence of President Trump himself. He places a lot of emphasis on personal relations with other leaders, particularly strong leaders. We saw this today and yesterday in his visit to China. On the other hand, he plays havoc with the administration's strategic messaging. So the articulation of policy, particularly by him, is neither disciplined nor consistent. So if the content of U.S. policy seems coherent, that's because it is, or as a result of an incoherent policy process. A coherent policy process doesn't necessarily lead to sound policy, but if an incoherent process creates good policy, it's probably more by luck than design. So that's Donald Trump. But I said he's not the sole source of the U.S. problem in engaging the world. He's a symptom of a deeper problem. And a key element of this problem is an unresolved debate within the American political system on the allocation of resources. Now, I begin with a truism that what any great power or small power is able to do externally will be a function of the strength of its domestic society. That was true of the Soviet Union, which fell apart. It has been true of the United States. It's true of Singapore. It's true of Japan, Korea, and so on. Over the last 40 years, I would argue the pillars of U.S. national power have atrophied. These pillars are mostly domestic in nature. They include economic growth based on improving productivity, fiscal balance, a capable civil service, an education system that provides skills for the future economy, state-funded infrastructure, and so on, and so on, and so on. We also need a political system that constructively can keep these various pillars robust. Informed Americans have known for some time that our society needs repair, but how to repair it has been the subject of intense and so far inconclusive political debate. Fundamentally, I think this is a debate about the role of the federal government in national life and the degree to which it should provide goods. And we saw in the 20th century a running debate on how much the federal government should be involved in domestic life. Some presidents argued for an expansion, others for a retraction. And Trump represents only the latest impulse on the retraction or retrenchment side. Now, my personal bias as a citizen is on the side of an active role for the federal government in America's national life. That is, it should provide public goods where they are necessary to enhance prosperity and social welfare for all. This doesn't mean that America should become a Scandinavian country, but it does require choosing precisely where to draw the line between public and private, between the state, market, and civil society, and the extent to which government should provide public goods and who should pay. These are ultimately ethical choices. I would argue that for at least 2 decades, the U.S. political system at the federal level has abnegated its responsibilities in making choices for the public good. There's no question that many Americans have been left behind during the march of rapid technological change and globalization. Donald Trump sold many on the idea that globalization through trade agreements created the relative economic deprivation of some Americans. Most economists and objective observers believe that technological change and the failure to adapt workers' skills to new opportunities is the real culprit. In my view, that would argue for a greater role for the federal government, not a smaller one, particularly when it comes to supporting education, science, technology, all of which are key to increasing economic productivity. However, American politics has been locked in a stalemate among 4 different policy priorities and sets of political forces. The priorities are first, civilian government spending, essentially the public goods that the federal government provides. Second, mandatory spending on social welfare, especially pensions and health care. And the closer I get to retirement, the more I care about that priority. Third, defense. And fourth, the reduction of the levels and incidence of taxation. That is not spending money on these other priorities. Sometimes there's an emphasis placed on reducing the federal deficit, but that doesn't seem to be on people's minds right now. Now, each of these priorities has supporters and opponents in our political system. Supporters and opponents represent the interests of broader constituencies. Democrats tend to favor civilian spending and social welfare. Republicans give preference to defense, tax reduction, and sometimes deficit reduction. No group of supporters has enough power to impose its will. Each group of opponents has the ability to veto initiatives that it does not like. Efforts during the Obama administration to reach a compromise among these 4 was unsuccessful. Who deserves the blame for this failure depends on who you ask. On underlying this statement, this stalemate, sadly, are signs that America is becoming two societies, one that is ethnically diverse and the other white, one that is suburban and urban and the other rural, one that is prosperous and upwardly mobile and the other struggling and downwardly mobile, one well-educated and the other without even a college education, one optimistically welcoming change and the other pessimistically resentful of change, one progressive and the other conservative, one that was attracted to the charisma of Barack Obama and the other attracted to the very different charisma of Donald Trump. And to make matters worse, some politicians increasingly seek to gain power by playing these two Americas off against each other. I would say that even if Donald Trump ultimately decides to go back to the mainstream post-war grand strategy of military, diplomatic, economic, and political engagement with the rest of the world, he cannot carry out that strategy without resources. How much we spend on defense and diplomacy will define how active we will be in world affairs on a day-to-day basis. It's a good thing that right now defense is being protected from steep budget cuts, but we can see from the two recent collisions in which U.S. Navy ships were involved that there are serious problems with readiness that makes it easier for such accidents to happen. And we can't be sure that defense will be held hostage forever. We might call this the David Kennedy moment for America. David Kennedy is a Yale historian who in 1987 published a widely read book called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. His basic thesis was that existing great powers lose their position because their external commitments increasingly outstrip their resources. The inflection point of this transition may be a military conflict, but the sources of the inflection are economic. And some Americans are already speaking to this gap between commitments and resources and asking whether the gap will lead the United States to an inevitable withdrawal from world affairs. If we're going to reverse this trend, I would say the American political system will have to correct its own growing dysfunction. And there are many examples of this. We can talk about that in the Q&A. But the problems are serious. Finally, I would say on this question of our domestic policies, I'm not convinced that there is a true shortage of resources. True, we have an aging society that will drive up the costs of Social Security and health care for seniors. I'm sorry about that. I tell the next generation, but I worked for it, so you'll pay for it. True, there's a crying need to repair existing infrastructure. True, there's a serious shortfall in readiness in our armed forces. All of this will cost money even before we get to my more ambitious agenda of strengthening the pillars of national power. But in my view, and this will be my only truly partisan comment, the reason for this resource shortage, quote unquote, is the sustained battle that conservative forces in the American political system have waged against a progressive tax system. For them, reducing the tax bill for the wealthy and for corporations has a higher priority than maintaining the pillars of national power. And we see right now the new offensive they are mounting in this direction. Those forces, at least temporarily, have captured much of our political system, in part by playing on the grievances of those in our society who are left behind. And through their tax reduction efforts and their political power, those forces have deliberately deprived the government of the resources it needs to ensure that sufficient resources are available to fund the provision of public goods and sustain national power. This raises the unfortunate possibility that the United States will retreat from an active role in world affairs, less because of a lack of resources, but because of a lack of will. Less because of resources, but because of a lack of will. I wish I could tell you otherwise. I wish I could tell you that America's political leaders will get their act together and make the hard choices that need to be made. But the experience of the last administration, the Obama administration, is not encouraging. We had a president who was serious about policy. He understood the strategic importance of compromise, but he elicited little or no cooperation from the opposition party. Now we have a president who doesn't seem to care about the substance of policy, and whose art of the deal, quote unquote, approach is highly tactical. So I hope I'm wrong, and I hope American leaders do get their act together. But all of this does have significant implications for U.S. policy towards East Asia, the topic I now want to turn to. With respect to East Asia, interestingly, foreign policy elites from both parties have agreed about the broad goals and general strategy, even though they've sometimes disagreed on tactics and on specific difficult issues. At least the military part of our strategy towards the Asia-Pacific is quite resource-intensive. So maintaining a constant presence in the region and ensuring our security commitments to allies and partners remains credible have required that we surmount the tyranny of distance. It's actually quite expensive to keep carrier strike groups here in the region. Our political allies have subsidized some of these costs and provided bases, but a lot remains for the American taxpayer to cover. Friends in the region get very concerned at this time of year, and they worry about whether the President of the United States will show up at APEC and EAS. That's important. I'm a little bit surprised that President Trump is going to both meetings. At the end of the day, in my view, what's more important than whether the President of the United States shows up is whether the aircraft carriers show up. These aren't going to be invulnerable forever, but until they become totally vulnerable, that's the way we project power. In addition to military power, we have economic power, diplomatic power, how we choose to use our capabilities overall and in service of what grand strategy are important. But if our capabilities deployed in East Asia are declining, and if our leaders back home are not able to address the chronic problems in our own society, then everybody in the region will get the message. China will get the message and act accordingly. Our friends and partners will get the message and make their own decisions. So it wasn't a good thing that both candidates in our last election stated opposition to TPP. It's not a good thing that President Trump canceled it right after his inauguration. This was so manifestly in the interests of the United States and of this region that to abandon it was a serious abnegation of leadership. In the process, it gave China more of an open field to seize the initiative in shaping economic architecture. I do hope that Japan's Plan B, sustaining TPP without the United States, is successful, but it would have been better just to stick to Plan A. Now, we're in a rather fundamental situation, I understand. It's one where a rising power or a reviving power, China, is seeking to expand its power and influence, and the United States, the key status quo power, is seeking to cope with that change. Power transitions are rare in human society. Each case is different from the last, so there's no playbook that Washington can use to meet the challenge that China represents to us and to our friends. China has some obvious advantages, an ambitious policy agenda, substantial budgetary resources, geographic proximity to East Asia relative to the United States, a willingness to impose economic sanctions, but also some skill in calibrating the choices that it makes. And one can see this week by week, month by month. One of the goals of China's grand strategy is to accumulate influence beyond East Asia, of course, through the Belt and Road Initiative, but within the region, its ambitions are more significant. Its goal is to become a maritime power, starting with the acquisition of the ability to deny its near seas to U.S. forces, but in pushing out its presence, in creating a more dominant position, it's been very clever not to move into violence the way Vladimir Putin moved into violence in Ukraine. This is an incremental, step-by-step approach that stays just beneath the threshold of U.S. tolerance. No single move that China makes is such an egregious change in the status quo that it merits a challenge. And it's been very difficult for the United States and our allies to cope with these gray zone conflicts. Our freedom of navigation operations demonstrated some resolve once they were resumed, but they haven't necessarily changed the reality on the ground. China's not always totally skillful. I remain puzzled why they treated South Korea so badly for so long. It's good for South Korea that that's changing. Singapore had its own experience. But these specific episodes suggest that the long-term contest between the United States and China will be decided not just by the shifting power balance between them, which is important, but also by the cumulative effect of their interaction on issues like North Korea, South China Sea, East China Sea, and the judgments that Beijing and Washington draw from those interactions about the basic intentions of the other. President Trump and President Xi Jinping talked today about the great potential for cooperation in the U.S.-China relations. I hope that that is the reality going forward, because that would lead China to have more positive judgments about the United States and vice versa. But we all know that recent experience has suggested that competition is perhaps more likely than cooperation. As I suggested before, as this interaction between the United States and China goes forward, our friends and allies will make their own decisions about what it means for their interests. It's been long a principle of U.S. policy that we would not force our friends to make a choice between China on the one hand and the United States on the other, but one can see movement towards a situation where making choices might now be necessary. Now, there are different ideas in the United States about what to do about this situation. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but basically they seem to be first doing more of the same and hedging our bets with China, even as China hedges its bets with us, and doing our best to maintain some kind of leadership role in the region, and avoiding putting our friends in the position of having to make a choice. Second would be a grand bargain with China, where we try to put all the issues on the table and come to a basic understanding to do a deal. I don't like this idea because I have a feeling that it would have bad consequences for our friends. It would probably be done in secret. It would probably result in another big communique, and I don't think we did such a good job on the first three. The third school of thought is to come to the conclusion that the United States is in an existential struggle with China across the board on all different kinds of issues, and that we need to mobilize all the instruments of national power to counter this. I frankly don't think that's going to work. I don't think we have the resources for that kind of strategy. I don't think our friends and allies would want us to go down that road. And I'm not sure it would work. Doing more of the same sounds like same old, but in the current context, it may be the best we can do. And as I've stressed before, if we're going to do it, we need to have the resources to execute it. To conclude, let me note that about 10 years ago, Fareed Zakaria had an interesting insight about the transition of power at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. He observed that Great Britain was already in economic decline, relatively speaking, but it played its political hand with great skill. It still ran the international financial system. It accommodated to the rise of the United States in the Western Hemisphere and the emergence of Japan in East Asia. It firmly resisted Russian probes towards India. It sustained its naval supremacy vis-a-vis Germany. And together with other European powers, it worked to manage and contain rivalries in North Africa and the Balkans until conflict management failed in the summer of 1914. I don't think that the American economy is inherently declining in the way that Britain's did 100 years ago, but unlike Great Britain, we have not always played our political hand well. We had a mixed record during the unipolar movement of the 1990s. The invasion and occupation of Iraq created costs in blood, treasure, and reputation that we are still paying. Our stewardship of the international economic system after 2000 led to the global financial crisis, 2007 and 2008. Our dysfunctional political system does not set a very good example for others to follow. The Obama administration tried to reduce our overextension in the Middle East, to consolidate our forward deployment in Asia, and to foster new economic architecture through the TPP and TTIP. He was willing to work with Republicans, but as I said, they weren't willing to work with him. In my humble opinion, President Trump has generally taken a not bad hand and played it badly. This week worked out pretty well. We'll see how long it lasts. In my view, the intellectual case that the United States should play an active role in world affairs remains strong. That's at least in the minds of foreign policy elites and the corporations that compete in the global economy. American leaders have been able, usually with some trial and error, to adapt the basic post-war approach to radically new circumstances. And the new circumstance that we're living with now is the revival of China as a great power. It should not be impossible to continue the strategy that emerged in the end of the Obama administration, but executing it will not be possible without political leaders in America who can build support for an active role for the United States, both among elites and the public at large, nor will it be possible unless American politicians act for the people than for themselves. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Please feel free to ask about anything you want.